Hello and good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our public lecture. A welcome to everybody who's watching on YouTube, as well as those people who are here in the room at Sheffield Hallam. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Jenny Pickerel to give the conference opening public lecture. And Jenny is part of the geographical community up here in Sheffield, and she is Professor of Environmental Geography and also Head of Department at the University of Sheffield. And I know Jenny a little actually from my time being a Head of Geography, and she actually is one of the most humane, caring and committed senior UK geographers that you could wish to know. We met actually on Zoom in the middle of the pandemic in meetings of UK heads of geography. But I invited Jenny to give this opening lecture as her research and writing, I think, speaks very directly to our conference theme of collaborative geographies. And Jenny is someone who has pioneered collectivist, participatory, and activist methodologies. And she's worked in many different places around the world. She has a long-standing interest in eco-homes and eco-communities, and she published a book on that theme back in 2016. She also continues to work on environmentalism and how the value of environmentalist thinking and practice can be understood. And as someone whose work crosses both human and physical geography, Jenny, I thought, was an ideal speaker to launch our annual conference. So Jenny's title this evening is Hopeful Environmentalisms. What is the purpose of hope in this time of multiple crises? Over to you, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Is my mic working adequately? Great. Yes, I want to talk on hopeful environmentalisms, in large part because we are living through a period of multiple global crises. And I want to discuss whether there's still reason to be hopeful, and if there is, what does that mean and what do we do with it? There are many examples of transformative grassroots change that for me are creative, generative, radical, inspiring and political, and I think they make a difference to people's everyday lives. But I want to ask some broader questions about what we do with those examples and what might be missing from some of those examples as well. So I want to reflect on what it means to still be hopeful in these terrible times by exploring some of those collaborative community projects that I've been working with for many years. And as John Holloway argues, it's the very horror of the world which obliges us to learn to hope. I'm focusing on environmentalism as that is my key area of research, and I've been working with environmental activists, principally in Britain and Australia, for over 30 years. And I've always been interested in the potential and the power of protest, of resistance and of refusal, but also always alongside this, how activists simultaneously propose alternatives and build creative, different ways of living. So the groups that I've worked with have always matched resistance with creativity for other possibilities. And it's in these possibilities that I find hope. So when talking about environmentalism, I'm using quite a broad definition that includes highly visible public campaigns and some of those big names like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, but also action in the everyday, doing things differently, and everyday lives. So quite a broad range of understanding of what it is to be an environmentalist or to take environmental action. And I've always been interested in what's actually being done in places and in practice to build a better world. So I'm an empirical geographer. I really want to see examples and then understand what that means. So that's what I'll be drawing on today. I understand the theme of the conference is around collaboration, and of course that speaks very much to my interests. So all of my work is focused on doing things collectively, doing them together, doing things as a community. To me, it's now unquestionable that community initiatives are central to those processes of positive social and environmental transformation. So I focus on grassroots collective efforts of emancipatory action, a sense of togetherness, even when it's not necessarily bounded to a place or delineated criteria of belonging. But for me, even in those darkest of times during the COVID pandemic, where I met Alistair online, the togetherness of community responses means that we should remain hopeful. And at whatever scale and wherever they happen, community initiatives can facilitate ongoing socio-ecological transformation that, to me, will create a more equitable, ecologically sensitive and just world. I also want to note that there's no perfect definition of community that works here. I'm using it in a deliberately open, fluid, polyvalent term, and we need to continually expand and test what we mean by that. So I don't want to suggest there is a perfect version of community and others don't count and like that. For me, communities remain fluid and emergent, and new forms continue to emerge. But as I said, understanding what holds people together but also pulls them apart, to me, is vital to exploring their potential. So all of my examples draw upon collective action and community as a state of being in common. So underpinning my interest in hope is not just a need to hold on to something other than despair as we struggle through these multiple crises, though on a personal level that helps me get through the day. And I realised about a decade ago I started describing myself as a hopeful geographer. So I think I was trying to embody some positivity somewhere. But also I've always been interested as a geographer as to understanding how and why people carry on despite such crises. I've been fascinated about how people find ways to survive, build things from very little, and in prefigurative action, that is, living now as they wish the world to be. But of course, none of these alternatives are simple or uncontested or complete or necessarily inclusive. So it's vital that we ask critical questions of all of these examples of how they work, why they fail, and what further problems they might generate. So this is some pictures from some teaching that we do here in Sheffield, where we take students to a variety of community organisations and get them to work with them for a day. It immediately generates a lot of questions about why am I digging a hole? What am I learning from this? And of course, it's quite generative actually in being able to ask them that, to reflect back on why they think that might be meaningless. But actually, it ends up always being a very good day. So hope in geography, it's a word that researchers, we use a lot. We often, I've done it myself, ended an article with, I've just given you 8 pages of depressing information, but hopefully it'll all be great in the long run. But we rarely explain what we mean by it, and in that way it can end up a bit of an empty signifier. And it's used a lot, but I worry that if we don't define it, it can be seen as quite a naive optimism, especially in the current situation. So some examples include recent work on how Palestinians embody hope as a moment to come in their resistance to occupation, or Fernanda's recent work on the 40-year-long struggle of the landless rural workers movement in Brazil to create territories of hope. Other workers work with Black Americans in Minneapolis and how they respond to violence and oppression by finding hope in transforming urban spaces themselves, rather than waiting for those to be formally transformed. But here I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Ankit Kumar at Sheffield Geography, for our ongoing conversations of hopefulness and hopelessness. And I'll be drawing on some of the work we're doing together here. The reason we're working is Ankit describes himself as a hopeless geographer and has challenged me to think more critically about hope and hopelessness interact. So I'm going to reflect on that too. So what do I mean about hope? For me, hope is a form of hopeful action. It's been too often dismissed as potentially naive or crippling. You can see how it might foreclose the possibility of action. In other words, if we have hope, then we might not see any need to change or challenge our current situation or practices. We can just be optimistic that everything will be okay. In particular, in relation to climate change, it's been argued that having hope might mean that we're simply hopeful humans will be okay, despite all evidence to the contrary. This is a very inactive and passive form of hope and a type of optimistic, wishful thinking. It's a kind of positive emotion that perhaps doesn't actually do anything other than make us feel better about where we're at. I also think it'd be quite individual that we can just say, well, be hopeful, it'll all go away, don't worry about it, and we don't have to think about our relations to other people. It doesn't demand action of the individual, and therefore they have little control over whether their optimism will be released. But instead, I'm interested in hope as an emotion and action, in hopeful action. Rosser argues that hope is the desire for X, a belief that X is possible but not certain, and therefore a mental emphasis on seeking to achieve X. In other words, hope is something that could or might happen if the hoper works towards it. This means that hope requires the hoper to be involved with their hope. It's not something passive. If we're going to have hope, we have to enact and work towards putting into practice what we hope will happen. So they need to have emotions, thoughts, plans, and actions that revolve around both the desire and the possibility of it coming about. And this builds on Bloch's articulation of emotion, hope as an emotion that requires people to actively engage in what is becoming. So in this way, hope is an action, it's a type of agency, and it's a political act. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. Hopeful people are actively engaged with defying or changing the odds, and hope is the fuel for agency. So it's not just wishful thinking, it emboldens us to take action to make that hope manifest. So it's political, it's a type of agency, and the most useful articulation of hope when we think about what we need to do around climate justice. So hope is a cognitive pathway which, when collectivized, provides practical ways towards transformative change. It can give us motivation, it can sustain us in this quest towards achieving a demanding goal, even when that goal might feel uncertain and unsure. So it's not about assuming that we know where we're going to get to, it's about putting into practice action that will help us bring that thing into being, even if we're not sure we're going to make it. So West uses the term transformative hope to communicate both the centrality of agency to the concept, but also that the intended outcome is broader social change. So it's about collective hope and hope for all, not about just individually wishing that you're rich. So it's a bit more kind of political in that sense. And then, of course, hope then is a future goal orientated. And research has shown that collectively imagining an alternative makes it appear more realizable. And that's the thing I'm really interested in, why community and collaborative action feels like it has more meaning and more potential. Because when you're doing it with other people, it feels more possible. However, hope, of course, is risky in the sense that it might slip into that optimism and that wishful thinking. It might hide some of the complexities of where we're at in the world. So hope is always deeply relational and exists in tension with hopelessness, and of course within potentially oppressive social relations and structures. In other words, we can't be naive in our hope and our quest for hopeful action. So hopelessness obviously removes the possibility of action and agency. It's a disillusionment that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're hopeless, then nothing can change. So I'm going to disengage from the possibility of it engaging. But of course, it's important to acknowledge why some people might feel this way and how and why communities are without hope, and how this course should challenge hopeful approaches to climate change. So Ankit Kumar argues that it's vital we do not ignore the hopelessness of the already marginalised, especially in the global south. Otherwise, we might engage in new forms of climate colonialism. So he outlines how a focus on hopeful action and urgency around climate change might end up creating a sense of universalism, which ignores crucial questions of difference, justice, rights, and responsibilities. And of course, if we understand climate change as a universal problem of urgency, then that leaves the space and opportunity to apply technocratic solutions that might smooth over some of those differences. The outcome, of course, is unjust and also likely to benefit those who are already privileged. So if we rely on technological solutions and say, well, we don't have time to discuss some of the democratic issues and to think through the consequences because we're literally 100 seconds to midnight. Well, that was last year, so I don't know where we're at now, probably less. Then actually we will be emboldened to apply solutions that will, of course, have a particularly negative effect on the already marginalised. Anke also points out that this sense of urgency around climate change is only really hitting the global north now because we are finally understanding that we are under threat. And for many in the global south, their worlds have already been irreparably changed. So there's a huge disparity in that sense of whose urgency, why now, and how we might use that urgency. So there is an importance here in using hopelessness as a route to radical justice. For example, expressions of hopelessness towards the status quo could be a powerful mobiliser of alternative actions. This, for example, from Greta Thunberg said, "I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. I want you to put into action something urgently." So hopelessness and therefore disengagement with certain practices, a refusal to hope in the current systems of governance, especially global climate governance systems, might come from a belief that this will force a change in the process. And there's some really fascinating work coming out around hopelessness in, for example, parts of Indonesia, where an Australian colleague, Australian geographer, has done work with the communities there around what they think their hopelessness around climate change in the future leads to. And for them, it's a powerful way of abandoning certain approaches in order to create space for different social justice possibilities. It's a refusal to engage in the capitalist, colonial, extractive processes currently laid out. So it's a political stance that says we're going to reject this idea that there's a universal us, that we can talk about climate change with one version and one voice. And instead, we want to say that the experiences with the universal make us hopeless. So hope as untethered, universal and placeless is not helpful because it erases the unevenness of climate injustice. So instead, we need to always work in the messy in-between tensions between hope and hopelessness, recognizing hopelessness and the importance of place in order to center social justice around climate change. And it's also really important to think about hopelessness because authoritarianism is an internal threat to community action. Environmentalism is haunted by the spectre of eco-fascism, visible in ongoing discussions around population growth, land rights, and paternalistic approaches to conservation. So I think if we are perhaps too optimistic and wishful thinking in our hope, then again, we manage to avoid dealing with some of the terrible consequences of some environmental thought. And one of the things that I have been working on is how exclusion, discrimination, and unequal power relations persist in apparently progressive spaces unless they're constantly challenged. So this tension between refusal and engagement is similar to the one I started with, describing environmentalism as being simultaneously resistance and creation. And to me, that's what gives me hope. Not that we should naively say, here's the way that we're going to change the world, but we are constantly in tension between resistance and creating a different way of being. So, in other words, when we invest in hopeful action, we acknowledge that at times hopelessness might also be a powerful response. And hope and hopelessness are always present and in relation to each other. And that also justifies my despair on certain days if I've watched too much news, listened to the government too much. What does that hopelessness do? Do I need to reflect on it rather than brush it aside? So I want to now just pass to explore two examples from my research which enables us to unpack these processes of hopeful action. The first one is around learning to work across difference in Australia. So environmentalists have long been accused of prioritising environmental concerns over social justice issues, and so in Australia in particular, ignoring Black and Indigenous needs. So I was interested in how national environmental organisations responded to these Indigenous demands in Australia, particularly when they work on campaigns in the north of the country, Cape York and the Kimberley, regions that have successfully secured, albeit partially, land back to Indigenous ownership and have a growing Indigenous self-determination and leadership. So to do this, I worked with environmental and Indigenous activists, examining their everyday lives and how their political ideologies and campaigns are complicated, tested and refined through practice. In other words, I went to the Kimberley and worked with a load of white environmentalists and saw how they got challenged by Indigenous views the whole time and how that changed not just their views, but their practices and how they're evolving their campaigns. And while you might think that that should have happened decades ago, for those of you who know Australia, there's quite a dated approach to race relations in Australia, which the environmental movement has used to ignore some of these broader questions around Indigenous rights for quite a while. So from this, looking at their everyday experiences, environmentalists learnt to work and navigate with Indigenous activists to develop more intersectional approaches to activism that in turn offered more hopeful solutions. So through these encounters with difference, environmentalists started to think differently about what their campaigns could and should do. They worked together across racial and cultural difference in shifting how environmentalism was done in these regions. So they shifted their language, their approaches and their priorities to centre Indigenous needs and demands. In the Kimberley, this involved co-creating economic alternatives. So when objecting to a big industrial development, normally they would just say, well, we'll get rid of the development and then we'll walk away, we've won that campaign. And instead, they've realised that they need to provide those alternatives as part of their campaign in order to support Indigenous living on the land that they are campaigning about. They also shifted to more practical projects, such as species protection, particularly turtles, through ranger programs. Again, kind of more conservation-like rather than activism, because that's what the Indigenous activists said they needed them to do. So they've shifted towards the creation of alternatives that benefit Indigenous people rather than solely focusing on objection and campaigning. And it was through sustained daily lived experience that they developed new forms of inclusive and intersectional environmentalism. And for me, this is a hopeful sign of hopeful action, opening up avenues for different approaches, offering ways to create space to think differently about what environmentalism should do. But of course, there's plenty of work left to be done. So there's two concerns that raise from this. The first is this question of inclusivity. On the left, you've got the Wilderness Society's original type of flyers. Complete absence of people, using the words like wild. They had a whole Wild Rivers campaign, even though it was in the Cape York, which is very, very lived in by a range of Indigenous people. So of course, Indigenous people are like, what are you talking about? Wild rivers. We're not even in these pictures, and yet that's our home. So there was a real push to change the way in which language was used, to the Australian Conservation Foundation, which shifted to using terms like people, culture and nature, and not using terms like wild and wilderness, and putting people at the top of the concern of some of these environmental campaigns, not, as you saw on the last slide, whales. So if you can see how there's a shift in how some of that iconography works. But when these things become tested, there always ends up a gap between the discourse and what these groups said they would do and what they do in practice. And that, I think, is the question that still remains in environmentalism, that they've got better at talking the talk, but actually when it comes down to it, will back an environmental win rather than what they might see as a compromise that provides some social justice outcomes. And one of the reasons this still happens is because privilege amongst environmentalists in Australia remains unanalysed. When I talk to them about whether they felt like they brought privilege to them in their activism, most of them said, oh no, not really. And so they weren't able to recognise their own privilege in race or class or gender, and how that produced ongoing processes of dominance in these negotiations with Indigenous activists. So when we look at these hopeful actions, we must always still ask around questions of power, who has the power to speak, who has the power to silence others, and how do people use or pretend that they don't have privilege in some of these spaces. The second tension that arises from this work is that environmentalism is always incomplete, so it remains partial and unfinished, always in the making. Now, in many ways, that's really positive because it means that we're always moving forward, we're creating new things, we're reflective on some of those complex ways in which we need to work in places like the Kimberley. But what I would say is that that also leaves it open to say, well, we didn't quite mean that to be the outcome. We're sorry that actually on this instance we didn't back Indigenous demands, but we're in the process of still learning. So despite working with Australian groups for about 20 years, they're still learning. And I think there's a need sometimes to say openness and incompleteness and being in the making is brilliant, but how long do you need to learn to take seriously other people's needs and demands? And so although I'd say that the iconography and language has shifted, it's still unclear the extent to which national environmental practices are successfully moving away from these kind of colonial forms of extractive environmentalism. And indeed, one of the things that we need to always analyse in these projects is not just what they might or might not achieve, but what they're lacking, what's missing, what's unsaid, what could be improved. And to me, recognising that these attempts at hopeful action will be imperfect is powerful, but requires us to keep asking questions. The second example is my ongoing work with a variety of eco-communities. For me, this is how environmentalists purposely build and put into practice alternative ways of living, producing, educating, and working. And eco-communities experiment in building new material infrastructures, houses, energy generation, food production, water and sewage systems, and crucially, social infrastructures, so how they make collective decision-making, how they share, how they live and work together. So eco-communities are deliberately defined as a broad concept that includes eco-villages, intentional communities, co-housing, and low-impact developments. There are relatively few large examples globally of sort of over 400 people, but you do have Findhorn in Scotland, Damanhar in Italy, Christiana in Denmark, and Auroville in India. But most are much smaller and less well known, and they're between 30 and 100 people. Cyber Linden in Germany is 150, Lilac in Leeds has 50 participants, Dancing Rabbit in the USA is 30. So the normal size is actually between 30 and 50 members. And what's interested me recently is increasing numbers of these are urban. So it's not just about a rural retreat. So eco-communities are about building and living overlapping lives, finding ways to exist together and mutually support each other. There's an ethos of do it together, not just do it yourself, which I really like, that's sharing, and also extended relations of care. So central to collaboration is the sharing of everything, resources, materials, space, skills, and care obligations. And the research recently has showed that it very much improves participants' well-beings. So I'm fascinated by eco-communities because they offer numerous forms of hopeful action that we can analyse. And also, of course, they're great to take students to. There are numerous examples of success within these, I would say. So they demonstrate how to build affordable eco-homes. They demonstrate how to build alternative economies based on land-based livelihoods or sharing and self-provision. They demonstrate how energy can be generated through wind, solar and hydro, how food can be provided ecologically, and how to live in an anti-capitalist way amongst capitalism. But again, this raises a couple of concerns. The first is that eco-communities tackle the structural causes of social environmental problems by building new ones, those new infrastructures, material and social. So they critique existing capitalist systems quite effectively. And they demonstrate the need and the benefits of building these alternatives collectively, not as individual lifestyle change. So they critique the idea that we will be saved through individual lifestyle practices or green consumption, and say something more radical has to happen. We literally have to build an alternative world. But of course, there remains a danger that a lot of these eco-communities primarily benefit the residents themselves. So if you're lucky enough to live in one of these, then that's a very nice life. But actually, they're reliant on others replicating them to spread it. And this replication is reliant on finance, on time, on skills and motivation that many people don't have. So a common critique of eco-communities is that they're a form of green-gated gentrification. Even when they're exceptionally low cost and built on the land, they're still exclusive in some quite important ways. And some groups do really well working against that. But the second concern, and as geographers, we should always ask this question around scale. As in, can community initiatives operate at a scale which facilitates broad, regional, or even national level change? So grounded in arguments that are decades old now around the pitfalls of localization, it's finally being acknowledged that the question of whether projects can be scaled up linearly misunderstands social change. So for a lot of eco-communities, they're said, well, they're not relevant until they're big scale. And what I would say is that that's asking the wrong question about how we understand social change to happen and the possibilities of hopeful action. This scalar approach limits our understanding of the possibilities of community initiatives and constantly consigns them to being marginal or niche. My understanding is that scale isn't linear. Actually, rather horizontal connections are made between places and initiatives which inspire these ideas and practices to travel. And we should be exploring how these ideas and practices travel and evolve rather than expecting large-scale versions to develop. So for me, it's in the mobilization of 1,000 different versions of community action that is hopeful, not in the building of large-scale eco-communities, which in themselves generate their own and new different problems around collectivity and decision-making. But of course, further work still required on what that means in practice. And one of the gaps in the research around eco-communities is how they work with the state. Because a lot of them are anti-capitalist and quite anarchist in their way, they articulate that they are autonomous and free from the state. Whereas in Britain, most of them benefit from state funding, not just on living, for some of them on welfare, but literally on having had £300,000 to £400,000 payments to help build some of their community hubs. So there's some really interesting work yet to be done on the messiness of what this means of building these alternatives while actually using state support at the same time. So while scale isn't a linear process, it can have a number of different implications in how we might understand eco-communities and what makes them work and encourages them to be built in the first place. So I did promise Alistair I'd speak for 35 minutes, so I'm going to conclude. I am a hopeful geographer, and so I do think there are many reasons to be hopeful and many examples of collective hopeful action. Hope depends on an ability to imagine a future distinct from the present, the relation to such future to specific events that could be defined as concrete goals, and a real possibility of achieving those goals. And of course, a lot of that requires supporting each other in imagining what that hope and that future might look like. And it's quite easy to slip back into hopelessness. As Ross has said, hope is the desire for X, a belief that X is possible but not certain, and a mental emphasis on seeking to achieve X. So hope is something that might happen if we work towards it through hopeful action. And what is absolutely certain is if we don't work towards it, then we certainly won't make any changes, which is one of the things that I think is vital to understand. But we have to, of course, try and avoid the risks of hope, the naivety and passivity of optimism, and to acknowledge the importance of hopelessness and refusal. And it's vital we engage with hopeful action critically. We always need to understand it as in tension with hopelessness and understand why so many people might have only hopelessness. I think we should believe in the possibility of collective hopeful action, and we should be teaching our students about these possibilities and sharing with them how they already exist in multiple forms. That they're imperfect, unfinished, and at times contested doesn't mean they've failed or that we can't learn anything from them. On the contrary, the only way to support further hopeful action is to learn from what's already happening, empower ourselves and our students to experiment in hopeful action themselves, while also acknowledging why hopelessness exists and what the power of refusal might offer. If you would like more examples of hopeful action, Ankit and I made a film with Time for Geography that's available, very much set in an eco-community at Hockerton in Nottinghamshire, so please feel free to view that. And the other thing that I've made is a comic, Living in an Eco-Community, which explores some of the tensions and difficulties of living in an eco-community. I've got some spare copies, and the book that was mentioned earlier. And that is it. Thank you.
Well, Jenny, thank you very much indeed. That was just wonderful, wasn't it? So inspiring, hopeful to start with. I asked Jenny to speak for around about 35 minutes, just because I thought it'd be great to have some time for some questions before we move on to our reception. So I've got the microphone and I will run to the part of the room where there might be a question. So I'd like to open the floor now to questions. There's one here.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Jenny, when policymakers are looking for solutions and things that can put to action, they're asking questions about can this scale and how can we roll this out? But that's not the right question. Could you tell a bit more what you think are the right questions, and from the point of view of decision makers, policymakers, when they're looking at these initiatives, what should they be asking?
I think one of the key things that I think they should be asking is, what does this particular place need, and how can we facilitate that community to generate what it needs itself? I think one of the dangers with policymakers wanting, can this be put here and then we'll scale it up, is of course it loses connection to the specifics of place, the specific needs of those different communities, and often will therefore fail. So some of the biggest eco-community fails are when they haven't taken the social infrastructure seriously enough and just said, here's a load of technology, we're going to build these houses and then it will work out. I think we know that communities need support to work together, to decide what they're going to do together, to understand different needs. And so I think for me, policymakers, as frustrating as it is, need to carry on working on that smaller scale, neighbourhood scale, and say, how can we facilitate change here? But it's going to look different than it will down the road. And that means it's more likely to work.
Thank you. Further questions?
Thanks, Jenny. I just want to ask, we're hearing a lot about teenage mental health in particular. Is that partly due to this feeling of hopelessness about the environment and where what's going? And by being hopeful, it's kind of a way of turning this around and helping them to cope with their lives as they unfold.
Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching kind of a hopeful geography for many years. But I realised a good decade ago that our students were quite depressed around climate change. They come to university fully aware of what we've done to the planet. And what we were finding was that when we asked them, they said that the geography degrees depressed them further because they could tell you all the different ways in which the world is ruined. And so we started a module called Ecological Futures, where we said, right, you know all of the stuff about climate change, you know how bad it is. What we're going to do is identify 4 different strategies that might be more hopeful. Of course, they're not perfect, but let's go out into the world and have a look at them and just see what you might be able to take from it without, not being critical. But I think that that seems to have got worse, that climate anxiety. And the last thing I want to do is depress young people. That doesn't seem a good outcome in education. So, yeah, I think it is important that we find in ourselves and communicate what hope we might have. But as I said, Ankit said that he's a hopeless geographer, and I'm not sure he can turn that around. But that's why we're working together, see how we can maybe do that together.
Can I maybe just pick up on that and actually what you're talking about in conclusion, which is how you might bring hopeful action into a classroom. Many people here are teaching at secondary level, primary level, some people at university. You gave some examples of your own work, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about what you do with your students, but there are some more subtle things there about kind of language that gets used, and whether that's something that we will reflect on in our practice.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the language continues to evolve, and now we're at a point where it's quite common to call it a climate emergency, and we talk about multiple crises, and I was writing something the other day and I listed about 10 current global crises, and I think that the word crisis and emergency and doom are really quite powerful, and I'm not saying that they're not useful and important politically, but I think one of the things that we can do with students is start at a different point and say, what do you hope for and how might you get there? To me, it's just important to show there are other ways of doing it, but also to get them to put themselves in those places. So in my work on eco homes, I wanted them to reflect on where they lived. So I didn't want to assume, most of them live in cold, leaky Sheffield houses. And so we talked about the problems of those, and then we talked about what might be possible, what's not possible. But at least I want to recognise where they're at. So I think it's important that we recognise how students are feeling, as well as pointing out different ways of doing it.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
Thank you so much for your warm talk and encouraging us as practitioners and teachers and people who live on the planet. I'm a graduate of the Fintorn Experience Week before I became a teacher, and the last presentation on that last evening has enriched my teaching, and it was entitled From Personal to Planetary Transformation. And the person who presented it was Alan Featherstone, who decided to launch Trees for a Future after the climate change conference, and he talked about what can I do, and he just started planting trees in that area. You're not going to know all this, but I just think that from about 15-20 years ago, when we were looking at what citizenship and geography could do together, then why am I the geography teacher, also the person who coordinates recycling, and we talk about planting trees at school? It's all connected with that. And you give me so much more energy for my role in that. So there's no question, just appreciation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any further questions in the room? I'm thinking about the one at this end of the room. Okay. Well, Jenny, I wanted to once again say thank you for starting things off for us in such an inspiring and very hopeful way. I think it's great. It really illustrates, I think, the importance of our theme for this conference, thinking about how we can work together to address some of these major planetary crises that we currently face. So, the arrangements for the next part of the evening are as follows. Everybody in the room is invited for complimentary drinks at Kelham Island Museum. And we actually have a coach which will seat 70 people that will be leaving from outside of the building. If you head towards the front of the building, people will guide you. It's actually leaving from Paternoster Row, for those who know Sheffield. We have 70 seats on that bus. It's actually not very far to walk to Kelham Island Museum. So I'm going to be walking, and our immediate past president, Alan, is in the room somewhere. I know that he knows the route, as I'm sure many of you do. So we can all follow Alan down to Kelham Island Museum. After the drinks reception, there will be dinner for those people who have booked dinner. But let me just emphasise that everybody is very welcome indeed to join us for the drinks. But before we leave, can we just thank Jenny one more time?
and I've put my email there. I'm very happy to have ongoing conversations if anyone wants, because I'm pretty terrible at reaching out to teachers, so please contact me. And don't make me take all these comics back with me, so do come and take them. Thank you.
Perfect, absolutely brilliant. I'm sure there'll be some takers. Yeah. Nice to see you. Yes, yeah.